Who's this Deku? And why do all the pros want to adopt him? By 80sGayTrashGoblin. Chapter 29. Some new, some familiar faces.
You can't afford to use your time up before school,
Nezu said, taking another sip of his tea.
especially with the security breach yesterday.
He laid a paw on the hero's knee.
Trust in other heroes to take care of petty crime. Your students are the ones who need you.
Yagi sighed, staring despondently down at his cup of tea. I know. It's just that All Might is the hero who is there. If he sees a crime, he steps in to help.
And that has served you well in the past, but your time is limited now. You have to prioritize your students.
Nezu sat back, taking another long sip of his tea.
Well, now that we have the time, why don't we go over the lecture you missed last week?
The door opened suddenly, revealing an out-of-breath Tsutsumi, panting and clutching her laptop to her chest.
Nezu, sir, we've lost communication with the USJ.
One of the best things about his brother is that he has little brother privileges for piggyback rides. The Hawk's taxi doesn't have to deal with traffic or tolls. Today's lesson was analysis of disaster and rescue scenarios. It was an area that Izuku was unfortunately lacking in. He does a little bit of that when he does analysis of rescue heroes, but most of his work skews towards villain analyses and takedown strategies. It was important work, but he can't neglect disaster scenarios, and he had to remember to incorporate rescue tips into his general hero analysis. Keigo and 13 were going to be at the USJ early, while Aizawa would be waiting on the main campus for his students, probably napping. Yagi and Nezu were supposed to be there too, but when they landed, the two teachers were absent.
Where's Yagi-san and Nezu-sensei?
Izuku asked, jumping off Keigo's back and making him stumble with a muttered, "Shit!"
All Might hasn't arrived yet, so Nezu is waiting for him on the main campus.
You know where you're going, kiddo? Keigo asked, ruffling his hair. Izuku swatted him off.
Yeah, Nezu-sensei showed me the blueprints while we were going over the UA's security systems.
The two heroes looked at each other worriedly.
What?
The staff meeting yesterday was about plans of emergency in the event of a villain attack. Keigo started to play with the feathers on his wings nervously. Well, a plan was put in place for the main campus. The biggest concern was the field trip here.
And you were banking on having All Might here.
I can certainly take on any villains that may attack, Keigo declared, trying to reassure them and himself. But I don't want to risk any students getting hurt. I'd certainly appreciate the backup.
Don't worry, Keigo. I'll stay safely in the console room. You should head there now,
13 said.
Get comfortable down there.
Izuku hiked up his bag with a smile.
Don't worry, guys. I'm sure it'll be fine.
Kyoko was an observant person out of necessity. She can't turn her advanced hearing off, but she'd learned how to tune out meaningless chatter and only hear the important shit. There's always an adjustment period, though. It takes about a week for her to learn what to tune out. On the bus to the field trip, she hears the arguing between Kirishima, Kaminari, and Ashido about the best Pokemon. She hears the muffled conversation between Hagakure and Uraraka about what kinds of hero they want to be. She hears the very loud conversation between Inasa, Ida, and Aoyama, with Todoroki interjecting snarky comments and Yamamo holding in giggles. But most importantly, she hears a one-sided phone call between Aizawa-sensei and their principal, based on the muttered rat bastard about All Might and a possible villain attack. When the call was finished, she looked over at Shoji. He gave her a small nod. He heard it too. So they were the only ones to feel a sense of dread when they entered the USJ. And they were the only ones to recognize the danger when a portal opened in the plaza. Keigo bit back a curse as he watched the portal form in the plaza.
Get back! Those are villains! Follow 13 and get out,
Aizawa shouted from behind him.
Hawks, I'll cover you. If you're sure you can keep up, old man.
If you're sure you'll be able to take on the whole crowd at once.
Speak for yourself, Birdbrain.
I know I can. Izuku held his breath, eyes wide as he watched the screens. His hands shook as his eyes were glued to one screen in particular. He vaguely registered at the back of his mind the misty villain warping villains into the complex, scattering his classmates, but his eyes were glued to the woman that stepped out next to the villain covered in hands. She was wearing a dark purple kimono, with plated armor where the obi would be. Notably, she had 4 arms, and 2 spikes behind the back of her ears. She was tall and slender, with a simple mask covering the bottom half of her face. Notably, her hair was pulled up in a half-up, half-down bun, with chopsticks stuck in the bun, with her hair going down to her mid-back. Even with the mask covering the bottom of her face, he could recognize her. The signature dark green Midoriya hair, the hairstyle. His brain was connecting the dots, but he didn't want to acknowledge the conclusion he was reaching. He didn't know how long he stood there, shaking, when he heard the door open. He whirled around, pulling the knife out of his pocket.
It's just me.
Aoyama stood in the door, his hands up. When Izuku put the knife down, he lowered his hands.
I didn't know you'd be here, monsieur. Me and Natsu-sensei were supposed to watch from here for my lesson on integrating disaster scenarios into my analyses.
Izuku sighed, running his free hand through his hair.
You are Natsu's student, though, oui?
Aoyama said.
Do you know how to use the systems for this place?
That's right. Natsu taught him how to use the security systems and auto setups. He can use that to guide the others to the exit. Their signal to the outside world might have been cut off, but if Ida escapes outside, he can run and get out. He cracked his knuckles, pushing his feelings aside like he did when he saved Bakugo from the sludge villain. Emotions could come later. His priority was getting his classmates to safety.
Aoyama, guard the door,
Izuku said, pulling up the console.
I'll keep everyone safe.
In the fire zone, Ojiro covered his mouth with his tail, following the trail through the maze of fire. He swears that the paths weren't there before, opening before his eyes, but he's not going to question not having to fight the villains. In the mountain zone, Momo, Jiro, and Kaminari hid under a camouflage blanket, watching as a landslide triggered from seemingly nowhere swept the villains away. In the landslide zone, Shoto watched as the villains sunk into the mud, being trapped by something that looked like quicksand. He didn't question it too much. It would make it easier for him to question them without overusing his quirk. In the ruins zone, Inasa lifted Kirishima above the winds using his quirk. Noticing the building shook and dislodged the villains. Despite the fact that he hasn't seen him, He has no doubt that his friend Midoriya was helping them. In the downpour zone, Tokoyami and Koda held hands as they ran through the dome, following the trail made by the absence of rain. Koda noticed that around them, the rain increased so much that it was practically pummeling the villains. In the flood zone, while Tsuyu, Shinso, and Toru were planning a route of escape atop the ship, they felt it shake around them, as the water started draining from the area. As the villains panicked about the water being removed, Tsuyu took the opportunity to leap to safety with Toru and Shinso in tow. At the entrance, the lights above the door started flaring, stunning the warp villain for a few seconds. It bought Tenya the precious seconds he needed in order to open the door and bolt. When the villain disappeared, his peers took the opportunity to pull 13 and themselves outside, giving each other impromptu medical attention. Some classmates, as soon as they escaped their zones, ran for the exit and joined their peers. Some went to the plaza, ready to help their teachers if need be. Keigo grinned, pinning down another villain with his feathers. He spun around, hitting a villain in the nose with his elbow and launching him into the dude behind him. He ducked, feeling the capture weapon whip over his head as it smacked someone else in the face. He and Aizawa fought well together. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw the villain covered with hands scratching his neck.
All Might was supposed to be here.
Keigo kicked another villain towards Aizawa, who wrapped him up and smacked him into a different villain.
How are you expecting to defeat All Might with a crowd of D-listers?
Handyman growled, scratching his neck again.
Nomu! Kill the bird!
Time felt like a split second before he was dodging the punch of a hulking villain, who up to this point had been standing next to Handyman's side like a lifeless doll. When he looked down, he saw that the villain had left a crater. He was very glad that he wasn't standing there.
The Nomu was built for the sole purpose of killing All Might.
So, the villain was blindingly fast and also ridiculously strong. He didn't like to resort to maiming, but he also didn't like the idea of being maimed himself, especially since this thing seems to be only punching. Keigo flew up, pulling out a few of his feathers for blades. He tucked in his wings for a dive bomb, using his speed and momentum to slice the Nomu's arm clean off. To his horror, the arm starts regenerating.
That's the power of Nomu!
Handyman shouted. From where he was standing, out of the corner of his eye, he saw the woman fighting Aizawa.
Both shock absorption and super regeneration.
Shock absorption implies there's a limit. Unfortunately, Keigo's a speed hero and not a strength hero, and that means that he can't get there without getting up to ridiculous speeds, which he does not have the time for right now. It has to have weak points though, and the number one weak point sticking out to him were the eyes on top of the exposed brain. Switching gears, he leapt up into the air to avoid another punch. Swerving through the air, he flew above the Nomu, plunging the feather blades into his eyes. It shrieked, dislodging him and sending him backwards. Spreading his wings out, he watched it try to pull the blades out of its eyes, but it ended up just flailing, lodging the blades in deeper.
Syringu, help the Nomu. I'll take care of Eraserhead.
Faster than a blink, the woman jumped up, vaulting over Nomu's head. She used two arms to pull the feather blades out of the Nomu's head and towards her palms, while she used the other two to summon two crescent-shaped blades, launching them at him. Keigo used two of his feathers to deflect the blades. She launched herself at him, and in the blink of an eye she was in front of him, one palm towards his chest. He felt his heart move in his chest. Before he got the chance to move, she was gone. The Nomu, blood still dripping from its quickly repairing eyes, was about to punch him. It's not well known, but due to having an avian quirk, Keigo's body has to adapt to fly. His bones were hollow, which meant that his body was light enough to fly, but his bones were very easy to break. He could feel his ribs break, digging into his lungs. Blood filled them as he was launched backwards. He hit a tree, slumping over and coughing up blood. He stayed slumped, giving off the illusion of unconsciousness while he subtly sent his feathers out. He heard small footsteps running up behind him and eternally cursed.
Get the hell out of here, kid. Nomu! Kill Eraserhead!
He looked up, using a feather to yank Aizawa right out of the way of a Nomu punch. Suringu summoned 4 more crescent blades, launching them at him, which he deflected with his feathers. She ran at him, and in a blink...
Warp reflection! Flashbang!
Keigo squinted as a bright flash lit the area, stunning the woman. He could hear Hagakure land next to him as he stood up, using the opportunity to send a couple of feathers out. They hooked on Suringu's kimono, yanking her backwards towards the fountain.
Kid, get out of here,
he said, stepping in front of her and instinctively shielding her with his wings. He didn't notice how they puffed up, how long repressed instincts were coming up in the form of heightened emotions and protectiveness.
Sensei, you're hurt. Please, let me help. I said, get out of here! Crack.
Aizawa was down on the ground, a crater around his head. His elbow was bleeding, dust around the edges of his skin, and underneath the goggles, blood was pooling in the crater. The Nomu roared. It was just him. Keigo hooked a feather on the back of Hagakure's belt, yanking her out of the way as he dodged another punch from the Nomu. He flew up, swerving midair because the Nomu jumped and apparently had mad ups. When it landed, there was a bigger crater than there was before, which gave him an idea. Unfortunately, before he could act on it, he was dodging both the jumping, punching Nomu and crescent blades going for his head. He flinched as one sliced through his shin, just barely managing to dodge the Nomu. Then, 3 things happened all at the same time. The door to the USJ slammed open. Handy Villain had lunged for Hagakure, touching her face with 5 fingers. Hand still on her face, he turned to say something to Aizawa, who was using his quirk. Keigo tunnel-visioned, focusing only on the Handy Villain. Tucking in his wings, he dropped, dodging 2 crescent blades above his head, picking up one of his feather blades as he dove. He got there just in time to cut off his fingertips. The villain howled, clutching his wrist as he stumbled backwards.
I noticed your quirk required 5 fingers.
Keigo splat out blood, standing in front of Hagakure.
Wonder how you'll use it without them.
Unfortunately, the Nomu was charging both of them. Excuse me. With a gust of wind in the blink of an eye, he was near the tree line, away from the crater in the ground which would have crushed his chest. He was being held bridal style by Yagi in his All Might form, with Hagakure clinging to one arm. The sudden movement was not great for his lungs, as he coughed up blood when Yagi gingerly set him down. It pissed him off how Yagi treated him so gently, like he was bound to break at any moment. But then again, he couldn't entirely blame the guy. He was sure he looked like shit. Coughing up blood, missing several feathers in his wings, and a bleeding gash in his leg. Mainly, he wanted an excuse to continue being angry at Yagi, because he didn't want to admit that the guy was growing on him.
The big villain has some sort of shock absorption and super regeneration,
Keigo said, wiping the blood from his mouth.
I can handle the other two.
Will you be alright, young Takumi?
He grinned, summing his feathers back to his wings.
I'll be fine. Focus on the big guy, big guy.
Toru hid behind a tree, completely invisible and feeling helpless. Hawks had flown off to fight the kimono woman again, and they were both out of sight. The misty villain, who initially scattered everyone, was standing right next to the villain covered in hands. She learned his name was Shigaraki. And All Might was currently fighting the Nomu. She watched as Saringu reappeared next to Shigaraki, the edges of her kimono stained in blood and frost. Her heart leapt to her throat as All Might suplexed the Nomu, with a portal wrapping around All Might's midsection. Her eyes barely registered a red blur as Hawks tackled the misty villain, causing the portal to dissipate. 2 red blurs followed him, feathers cutting off the tops of Saringu's horns and Shigaraki's other hand. She shivered as the ground froze over, with Todoroki standing at the edge of the plaza.
Damn it, kid! I told you to get out of here!
All Might laughed boisterously, starting to pummel the Nomu.
You said that he has shock absorption, which means that there's a limit. I must surpass that limit.
Toru watched as her teacher and her classmate fought the 3 villains. As All Might pummeled the Nomu, and her stomach dropped. They were risking everything, and she was hiding behind a tree. Fed up, a feather dragged Todoroki to where she was standing, and their eyes met.
Give me a boost,
she said, starting to run. He nodded and used his eyes to launch her into the air. As she flew, she angled herself so that her back was to the sun. Putting her hands on her chest, she willed her body to focus, like a magnifying glass.
Warp refraction! Laser!
The laser pierced the Nomu's chest, causing it to howl. With a few last punches, All Might sent the Nomu flying through the domed roof of the USJ. As Toru fell, she felt feathers cushion her fall, slowing her down so she was gently set on her feet. Still clutching her chest, she watched them fly back to Hawks, who was now standing next to All Might.
Tomura,
the misty villain said, standing next to Shigaraki, who was still clenching his stump arm.
The Nomu is out of commission. We must leave.
No! All Might is weak! We can still...
2 gunshots rang out in succession, piercing both of Shigaraki's legs. The misty villain swallowed the 3 of them up, and they disappeared, as if they were never there to begin with. Her legs shook as she hugged herself. She watched as a cement wall was put up in front of them, watched Present Mike run to the battered body of Aizawa-sensei on the ground, watched as Hawks passed out and fell into All Might's arms. This didn't feel like a victory. Kaina ran through the short hallway, Netsu perched on her shoulder. Her arm was still transformed into a rifle, and her mind kept flashing through the worst-case scenarios. She saw the French kid, Aoyama if she remembered correctly, standing guard in front of the door.
Kid, have you seen any villains?
He shook his head.
None, madame. I don't think they expected anyone to be here.
He stepped aside, letting them enter the room. It was dark, lit up only by the screens connected to various cameras. She could see a laptop shut on the console, decorated in stickers of various heroes. A figure was barely recognizable, only his green hair illuminated by the monitors, slumped onto the console with his head in his arms. The only thing that could be heard were heart-wrenching sobs. Ooh boy. Alrighty, y'all. So that's where we're going to go ahead and wrap up for now. As I said, these episodes will probably be shorter for the time being until I'm back to 100%. As you could probably tell, my voice cracked a few times even doing the one chapter. But I thank you guys so much for coming and hanging out. I hope you guys are willing to check out my streams over on Twitch if you haven't already. I will be posting links in the community tab when I am going live on Twitch for that. And yeah, thanks for coming and hanging out. I really enjoyed the chapter. Much love to 80sGayTrashGoblin. Their stuff is always fire. And yeah, all that being said, I look forward to seeing you guys in the next video and on stream, and I will catch you later. Ciao for now, lovelies.